I'm introducing these anatomy videos aiming at simplifying the basic anatomy with some correlation of the clinical anatomy by using mostly cadaveric specimens, which are more reliable to understand the basic anatomy. Kindly subscribe for these videos to reach more audience, and also share and like the videos to promote them and to get them on the main screen of the YouTube. Thank you. Now to the coming session. In that session, we are going to describe the posterior triangle of the neck. The triangles of the neck, looking from the anterolateral side to the neck, is divided into two triangles, anterior triangle and posterior triangle, by the sternocleidomastoid. Here is the anterior triangle, and here is the posterior triangle. The roof of both of them, the anterior and posterior, is made by the investing layer of the deep fascia of the neck. The deep fascia have three levels: investing layer, the most superficial, prevertebral fascia in front of the prevertebral muscle. In between there is what we call it the visceral fascia, which include the carotid sheath and the brachial fascia. For the anterior triangle, it is redivided into four small triangles. The submental triangle between the two anterior bellies of the digastric muscle, the digastric triangle between the anterior and posterior belly of the digastric and the base of the mandible, the carotid triangle, which is bounded by the anterior border of the upper half of the sternocleidomastoid and the superior belly of the hyoid, and lastly the muscular triangle, which between the superior belly of the hyoid and the lower half of the anterior border of the sternocleidomastoid. Here is a cadaveric specimen to show again the two triangles, the posterior triangle and the anterior triangle, and the parts of the anterior triangle. What we can see here is the submental triangle, that is the submental triangle here in the anterior part, between the two anterior bellies of the digastric muscle, as we said, and the digastric triangle below the base of the mandible between the two bellies of the digastric. That is the carotid triangle, the largest one of them, which lies between the upper part of the anterior border of the sternocleidomastoid and the superior belly of the hyoid and the posterior belly of the digastric. And lastly, that is the muscular triangle, which is bounded by this superior belly of the hyoid and the lower part of the anterior border of the sternocleidomastoid. This is an introduction to the anterior triangle and will be dealt with in another session. Let us start the posterior triangle relations, boundaries, and contents. Starting with the borders of the posterior triangle, that triangle has an anterior border which corresponds to the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid, that line here and here, a posterior border which is the anterior border of the trapezius muscle, an apex which is the meeting of the two borders at the superior nuchal line, here you can see it there, a base which corresponds to the middle third of the clavicle down. These are the borders of the posterior triangle. As for the roof, as we said, the investing layer of the neck will form the roof of both the anterior triangle and the posterior triangle. So the roof of the posterior triangle will be together with the skin superficial fascia containing the platysma and the external jugular vein, which we can see here crossing the sternocleidomastoid. It will be the deep fascia, which looks in white here, part of the general investing layer of the neck. Now that is another diagram showing the floor of the posterior triangle. That one in light blue is the prevertebral fascia. We said there are three types of fascia. That is the prevertebral fascia, which covers or forms the floor of both triangles, as you can see here. You can see also the shadow of the muscles, which are deep to the fascia of the floor. Between the fascia and the muscles will be the other contents of the triangle. So that is the deep fascia over here, the prevertebral. That is a cadaveric specimen after removal of the prevertebral fascia from the front of those muscles which lies deep to it. Those muscles are from below upwards, which form the floor. The scalus anterior muscle, this muscle over here, which may appear if that clavicular head of the sternocleidomastoid is small, as it looks here, but if it is large, it will cover that muscle. Above will be the scalus medius, and the scalus medius with the scalus anterior, there is the brachial plexus, the roots and the trunks in between. Above the scalus medius will be the levator scapulae. More above will be the splenius capitis. At the apex, the semispinalis capitis may appear over here. In case of the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius, which reach the superior nuchal line, are apart from each other, that muscle, the semispinalis, will appear as part of the floor. That is another specimen, cadaveric specimen, to show the muscles in the floor of the posterior triangle after removal of the prevertebral fascia. Here, an example of the variations which you can face in posterior triangle operations or working on it. What we can see here, that is the splenius capitis above. That's the normal appearance. The levator scapula here is two parts, which is not a normal thing. And then here is the what we call it the scalus posterior. It is not often to be appearing in the posterior triangle. Then that is the scalus medius, and lastly that is the scalus anterior. So that is the variation which you could face in the floor of the posterior triangle. About the parts of that triangle is divided by the inferior belly of omohyoid, which you can see it here. It is one of the contents of the triangle, into an upper one, which is large, the occipital triangle, and a lower one, which is the subclavian or supraclavicular triangle. That is the two parts of the triangle. When it comes to the contents, that is a cadaveric specimen showing the main contents, which will be described again. The nerves are the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, the spinal root of accessory, which could be one of these, but it will be seen in another specimens. The vessels are arteries and veins, subclavian artery, subclavian vein, suprascapular artery and vein, and so on, and other structures like the inferior belly of omohyoid, and that is the superior belly of omohyoid, and the lower deep cervical lymph nodes, which will be along the lower part of the internal jugular vein, posterior part or posterior to it. That is the lower deep cervical. The upper deep cervical will be along its anterior border above. And for the contents of the nerves in the posterior triangle, they are the cervical plexus, which give 4 muscular branches and 4 cutaneous branches. The muscular branches are to the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius as proprioceptive, and to the levator-scapular muscle, and a branch through the phrenic to the diaphragm. 4 cutaneous branches, which are the lesser occipital, the great auricular, the transverse cervical, and the supraclavicular nerves. The second group is the brachial plexus, which are the trunks and the roots, and the branches which come from the roots or trunks. The phrenic nerve, the dorsal scapular or nerve to rhomboids, nerve subclavius, nerve serratus anterior, suprascapular nerve, and branches to the prevertebral muscles. And lastly, the large spinal root of accessory nerve, which come from the junction between the upper third and posterior and lower 2/3 of the sternocleidomastoid, run along the fibers or the direction of the levator scapula to enter the trapezius muscle. These are the nerves. In this cadaveric specimen, we can see the cutaneous branches of the cervical plexus. Along the posterior border will be the lesser occipital, along the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid. On the substance or on the surface, anterolateral surface of that muscle will be the great auricular, which will divide into anterior and posterior branches when it reaches the ear, and that is part of the parotid gland reflected. One will be as superficial to the parotid, the one on the back of the auricle. And the transverse cervical, which crosses the middle of the anterolateral surface of the sternocleidomastoid to the skin of the anterior triangle. And lastly, the supraclavicular nerves, which are supplying the shoulder and the parts of the upper limb. To continue the contents of the posterior triangle, the vessels are arteries, which is the third part of the subclavian, and 2 branches from the thyrocervical trunk, that is this side here, and the cut edge on the other side. These 2 branches are the transverse cervical and the suprascapular. The occipital artery may appear at the apex in its way to the back of the scalp. The veins are the subclavian vein, this one here, the transverse cervical, which will join the artery, suprascapular vein, again with the artery, and the external jugular vein. What we can see here, that is the thoracic duct coming from the thoracic cavity up to the neck, where it will end at the junction between the internal jugular and subclavian vein. Now for the muscles. The first muscle, there are two muscles actually here which we are going to deal with. The sternocleidomastoid, which is this muscle here, arising by two heads. That is the sternal head from the anterior aspect of the mandibular sterni, and that is the clavicular head from the upper surface of the medial third of the clavicle. The insertion of that muscle will be in the lateral part of the superior nuchal line and in the mastoid in this area here. The nerve supply of that muscle, the motor comes from the spinal part of accessory, while the proprioceptive, the sensory, will come from the second, third, and fourth cervical branches. That is another specimen showing the sternocleidomastoid with its two heads, the sternal and the clavicular. The action of that muscle, with acts alone, each one of them will tilt the head toward the ipsilateral shoulder and simultaneously rotating the head to turn the face toward the opposite side. But when they are acting together, both sternomastoid muscles will draw the head forwards, and so they help the longus colli muscles to flex the cervical part of the vertebral column, which is a common movement during feeding. The action of the two muscles also used to raise the head when the body is in supine position. When the head is fixed, they help to elevate the thorax as enforced inspiration. That is the action of that muscle. The second muscle is the trapezius muscle, this very wide muscle which you can extend from the external occipital protuberance on the back of the skull down to the last thoracic vertebrae along origin. So the origin from the external occipital protuberance with the medial part of the superior nuchal line, then the ligamentum nuchae, which is the supraspinous ligament of the cervical spines, the vertebral prominence, which is the seventh cervical spine, and all thoracic spines and supraspinous ligaments. That is the origin. The insertion of that muscle, it comes to the root of the scapula spine, to the upper lip of the crest of the spine of the scapula, and the medial border of, as you can see here, is going to the root of the spine, the upper lip of the crest, and to the medial border of the acromion, and then the posterior border of the lateral 1/3 of the clavicle over here. The nerve supply, like exactly the sternomastoid, motor spinal part of accessory, proprioceptive will be through the third and fourth cervical. When it comes to the action of the trapezius muscle, that muscle acting with the levator scapula will raise the shoulder, the point of the shoulder upwards. Acting with the serratus anterior muscle will rotate the scapula forwards and upwards in the last degree of abduction, getting the arm above the head. Acting with the rhomboids muscles, it retracts the scapula, pressing back the shoulder. With the shoulder fixed, it may bend the head and neck laterally, backward and laterally. But the group of muscles which are the trapezius, the levator scapulae, the serratus anterior, the rhomboids, as a combined movement, they produce variety of scapular rotation at the shoulder girdle joints. That is the action of the trapezius muscle. Here we are adding some of the contents of the posterior triangle, which are not mentioned before, and these are the subclavian vessels, that is the artery and that is the vein, the great auricular nerve, which we have seen it with the cutaneous branch of cervical plexus. That is the brachial plexus. That is the trunks and the roots, which are the contents in the posterior triangle. They will go to give the cords here, and then the branches of the brachial plexus in the axilla. That is the phrenic nerve, which lies anterior to the scalenus anterior muscle. And that is the supraclavicular nerve, which is going to from the cervical plexus. That is the omohyoid, superior belly and inferior belly, with the content in the inferior belly in the posterior triangle. That is the internal jugular vein here. That is the internal jugular, which is this one here. That is the internal jugular. And that is the long thoracic nerve, nerve serratus anterior. And this is the suprascapular artery, which is this one, and nerve, which is this one here. Now, that is the subclavian artery, the main artery of the triangle. What we have seen before, that is the whole artery here. And on this side, that is the scalus anterior, which divide it into first part, deep to it will be the second part, and leaving the muscle will be the third part. So let's start by the first part, where we'll say that the right side, right artery, will arise from that trunk, which is the brachiocephalic, but on the left side, there will be arising from the arc of the aorta. That's on the left side. In the neck, it passes deep to the scalus anterior, as we said, to divide it into three parts. The first part, the second, and the third part. That is the scalus anterior here. Now, for the relations of this artery, let's start by the first part, where that is the first part here. Anterior to it will be skin, superficial fascia, platysma, and deep cervical fascia, and the sternocleidomastoid, which is crossing from medial to lateral up here. In the neck, it is crossed by the vagus nerve, which is this one here, and some cardiac branches of such nerve. The sympathetic trunk, which will be seen in a different slide, almost around here. Then the internal jugular vein, that is the internal jugular vein, will be crossing again the first part. And the vertebral veins have in their way to end in the internal jugular vein. On the left side, it's crossed by the phrenic nerve, that is the phrenic nerve which cross the left side. The thoracic duct, which you have seen it in the previous slide. The phrenic nerve on the right side is separated by the scalenus anterior muscle. That is the relations of the first part. When it comes to continue on the first part, below will be the dome of the pleura, separated by the suprapleural membrane. We can see a part of the thoracic cavity here, the lung, and the suprapleural membrane will be over here. The right recurrent laryngeal nerve will curve around the artery as it arises from that point to curve deep to the first part, while on the left side, that is the left recurrent laryngeal nerve, will be just medial to the artery. The relations of the second part. Here, anteriorly will be the skin, superficial fascia, platysma, and deep fascia. The sternocleidomastoid extending obliquely from this point to up to the superior line. The scalus anterior, which divides that muscle, that artery here, on this side, and that is the cut edge of the muscle. The scalus anterior separated from the right phrenic nerve, that is the right phrenic nerve here on the right side, and inferiorly will be this subclavian vein, which is in both sides. Posterior will be again the suprapleural membrane, the pleura and the lung. The lower trunk of the brachial plexus will be posterior inferior, while the middle and the upper trunks will be superior to it. That is the lower trunk here, and these are the two upper and middle trunks. That is the second part. While the third part, that is the third part here, after it leaves the scanless anterior, again will be the skin, superficial fascia, platysma. Supraclavicular nerves will be here near the shoulder and the deep cervical fascia. Then the clavicle will be anterior to it. The subclavius muscle, which is this muscle here, that is the subclavius muscle. The external jugular vein, which you have seen it in many slides before. The suprascapular vessels will be anterior to it. Below will be the first rib with the lower trunk posterior to it. That is the lower trunk here, posterior to the third part on the upper surface of the first rib. And the other two trunks, which you can see over here, are superior to it. That is the third part. When it comes to the branches of each part for the subclavian artery, let's start by the first, which is the vertebral artery. That is the vertebral artery which will go through the foramen transverse area to reach the cranial cavity. The thyrocervical trunk, which you have seen it, this one here, and this one here, which will give the inferior thyroid artery, that is the inferior thyroid, the suprascapular, and the transverse cervical. Then you'll see the internal thoracic artery of the first part again. From the second will be the costocervical trunk, this very tiny branch, small branch here, which will divide into superior intercostal, which go directly to the thorax, and deep cervical, which goes up in the neck. The third part, occasionally it gives what we call it the dorsal scapular artery. These are the branches of the subclavian artery. Let's have a summary of that area at the root of the neck. Clinically, it has many approaches and maneuvers. That is the scanless anterior on this side and this side. That is the scanless medius on both sides. That is the right recurrent laryngeal nerve on the right side of the trachea, between the trachea and the esophagus. And that is the left one on the left side of the trachea. That is the sympathetic trunk, and that is the middle sympathetic ganglia. That is the phrenic nerve on the right side, and on the left side here, that is the vagus nerve crossing the first part of the subclavian to give the right recurrent laryngeal nerve. That is the vagus here, that is the vagus. And this part here is what we call it the ansa cervicalis. This is a loop of sympathetic trunk fibers around the first part of the subclavian, connecting the upper part of the trunk with the lower part. That is the ansa subclavia. That is the thoracic duct, which I have seen it many times, coming from the thorax to open into the junction between the interjugular and the subclavian. That is a case of anomalous subclavian artery from the right side, which was part of a project on the spontaneous abortion of one of my projects. What we can see here is the common carotid on each side, here and here. We can see the right subclavian artery, which is coming deep to both the trachea and the esophagus. We can see the left subclavian artery coming from the arc of the aorta. You can see that is the arc of the aorta here, that is the heart, of course. And you can see the trachea, that is the trachea here. And deep to it is the esophagus. And that artery is deep to both of them. That is one of the anomalies of the subclavian artery. The most common is this right subclavian artery. At the end, thank you for your listening and hope it adds to your information. I will appreciate any comments from your side, which will help in advancing these videos. And thank you again for your attendance. Thank you.